Hi everyone, Sandra Duran Wilson here, and welcome to this week's Mixed Media Soul Sparks. This week I want to share with you some more panels, and I've talked about different surfaces to paint on, and Ampersand makes these wonderful panels, and the ones I'm going to be sharing with you today are aqua board and clay board, and I'm going to talk briefly about gesso board. Now, gesso board is just what it says. It's a panel. These are all hardwood panels that are primed and ready to go for you to paint. They're archival. They're really great to work on. Yeah, maybe it costs a little more money than, gessoing your own panel, but sometimes you want to make sure you have something that's going to really hold up to the applications you want to do. And what I love about the gesso board is that I can come in and put water on here and even some paint, and it's going to hold that paint. Many times, you look at surfaces and you hear about, well, you can't dilute your paint with water because it's not going to stay because it's breaking down the binder. But look at what's happening here. That was mostly water and just a little drop of the high flow paint. Just even take some plastic wrap, create some interesting texture. And look at what I have already. It is absorbing into that surface. And it's kind of, as it dries, it goes lighter because the water is evaporating. But I can dry this, I can come back in with more layers. I could do a thick paint application over it. It doesn't really matter what you put on this. It's ready to take whatever kind of application of paint you want. So I can work with it wet into wet and come over here dry. I love to paint with my fingers. Into here, I can blend this. So it's just a wonderful surface. You might even hear that a little bit. It's kind of a tooth to it. Pick up some of that. So that's gesso board. And you can get it flat panels like this. You can get it cradle board, different sizes. Now, these next two, clay board and aqua board. Aqua board was developed for watercolor artists, and you can use watercolor on this, and then you don't have to frame it under glass. But I like to use acrylic on it, and let me just show you one of the wonderful things that it does. Let's get this over here. Now, when you open it, they have a little instruction of how to flush out the air bubbles in here. And I'll show you what I mean. That if you take just water and you start to brush the water onto the surface, because this is like paper onto this wood panel. Again, it's the same archival board. And then when I brush the water on here, it gets absorbed into the paper pulp that's adhered to this. And as I brush it on and the water evaporates, it releases some of the air bubbles. But what if you like those little bubbles? And I'll show you what I mean. And it has to kind of sit for a moment. Let's move this out of the way. And can you see some of, it's hard to see, the white, but let me put some color on here and we'll start to see it. Let's go in here with this paint. And look at what happens when you put this on. How this moves on this surface. It just kind of, the water takes it, just like watercolor paper. These are the bubbles I'm talking about right there. And what happens with those bubbles, if you leave it like this, that they'll kind of pop and you'll see that impression. And I rather like those bubbles. I have nothing against those bubbles. It almost adds like a texture. So what if I come in here with an opposite color? This is an ink. Inks are very intense color, but they're very fluid. And if I spray a little water on here and just begin to tilt this and let it move, let's come around this way. You can create a really quick painting by just letting the paint and the water combine and move. This is a more opaque paint. You know, you can just play with these things. They're so much fun. Because if I leave that very wet paint like that, when it dries, it's going to create a very different movement. And I'll just leave this. Let me put a little more blue. We'll let this dry, and I'll show you the clay board and tell you a little story about clay board. If I can get the ink up. Here we go. Isn't it interesting how the colors mix with the water? And it's very much a watercolor painting, but it's with acrylics, it's acrylic inks, and when this dries, it's going to be permanent, unlike watercolor. I'm just going to let this kind of run off and mix that way. And I like to do this because then I start to see shapes that pop up. It's almost like becoming a landscape. And then I can go back in when this paint is dry and then start to develop it more as a landscape. Okay, I gotta stop playing with it. I'll leave it there. Now, clayboard is the original surface that Ampersand began with many, many years ago. And it's kaolin clay, which comes from South Carolina. And they have a process of where they adhere the clay to this panel. And it is a beautiful surface for working on. You can use oil, you can use acrylic, watercolor, just about everything. Here's the trick, is that you have to let it dry. You have to let it not just dry to the touch, but you have to let it consolidate. Meaning that if I put a thick layer of paint on here and maybe let it dry to the touch, a thick layer of paint with gel, let it dry to the touch, I could still then peel the whole thing off. And that's exactly what I did. Because when I was writing the first books, I was like, okay, let me see how well this stands up. And I came in with my very first layer and I mixed gel with paint and I used my knife and I spread it around. And it dried to the touch and I came over to the edge and I was able to actually peel the entire thing off of the surface. And I'm like, what's going on? So I called him up and I ended up having this wonderful conversation with Elaine Salazar, the founder and owner of the company, and we got into this whole thing and she explained to me how this works. So one of the things that you want to do with clayboard is you want to start with a thin layer on your first few layers. So I'm going to come in here with, just use some purple for a different color. Now, it doesn't have to be inks. You can be using fluid paints, high flow. You can take a heavy body and even dilute it with a little water. But look at what happens with this clay board. it also smells like clay. And I used to work in clay, and I love that smell of the earth. Now, let's just come in with some alcohol. And if you've ever struggled with getting the alcohol and wet paint to do this, the clay board is like the easiest one to get it to work on. I'm going to put another layer up here. And let me just get this dry. So this is still wet up here, but this should be dry. I want to show you something. So here, I'm wiping it, nothing's coming off. Now this is just water. And I'm just putting some water drops onto here. And I'm going to let it sit, and it's going to rehydrate the clay and the paint. And I'll be able to remove that paint. We know we can always remove paint, dry paint with the alcohol, but on clay board you can do it with water. So let's take a look here. You see where it's starting to come off? And I didn't let it sit very long, so if I give it another, maybe a bigger drop here and there. There's a big drop. And up here, this is still wet, but you can come in and you can blot that paint off. And you see how it goes back to white so easily. And that's the beauty of the clay board. Now, when you're removing paint, you want to start with a light touch, like what I just did. But here, if it's pretty dry, then you can come back in after you've started with a light touch and you can rub it harder. So look at this effect you're getting. By rubbing some off, you're getting more range of color there. Now this is where it was water, and I can take this. And now I can just come back in with another transparent color over this and build up these layers. I call this optical mixing because you're not mixing the colors together, you're letting your eye mix the color on the panel. And see how smooth it is? There's no brush strokes, no texture. It's just a very beautiful, smooth surface. One other thing that you can do while this is wet, because it's the clay, you can come in with any kind of a sharp tool and you can carve into the clay. I mean, you can go all the way in and remove all of the clay, but you obviously don't want to do that. But you can see that white line there. And with this particular tool, which is a clay tool, I can actually do a much bigger line. Then, after this is dry, I can come back in and add yet another color. So a few weeks ago, I was trying to use this stencil and remove some of the paint from a very absorbent surface, and had limited success. But let me just show you how easy it is on this clay board. Alcohol on paper towel. Hold it in place. Maybe if I had a better stencil that wasn't all messed up with paste and gels and whatnot, it might work better. But hey, we're working with what we got. So let me focus on this one area. You have to keep moving the towel because you can see all the paint is coming off. Okay, so now when I take this off, you can see this nice kind of arrangement. Even the clay is kind of doing this interesting thing. So I love to get all of these kind of textures, and yet it remains super smooth. So one of my favorite panels to work on, just so forgiving, just remember to let things dry in between, and I'll finish these up and show you what I've done with them, from the gesso board, aqua board, clay board. So many possibilities. I'll write in the notes some other ideas of things you might do with these, some tips and tricks of how to use them. And I look forward to seeing you next week, and make sure you post your work in the Facebook group. Bye. Join the Creative Awakening community on Facebook, where you'll be able to post your art, connect with other creatives around the world, and ask questions. Use the hashtag #MixedMediaSoulSparks when posting your work on social media. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next week.